Emma sat quietly in the corner of her small kitchen, watching steam rise from a pot of soup. The warm mist danced in the air like tiny ghosts before disappearing into nothing. At 16, she had learned that silence was safer than speaking. Her voice seemed to vanish whenever other people were around, especially at school where her classmates barely noticed she existed. The kitchen was her sanctuary. It was small, with old cabinets that creaked when opened and a stove that took forever to heat up. But it was the one place where Emma felt truly herself. The familiar sounds of bubbling pots and sizzling pans spoke to her in ways that human voices never could. Her mother, Kate, worked two jobs to keep their tiny apartment above the bakery on Miller Street during the day. She cleaned offices in the city center. At night, she worked at the local hospital, mopping floors and emptying trash bins. Kate would come home exhausted, her hands red and raw from cleaning chemicals, but she never complained. She would simply kiss Emma's forehead and ask about her day. Money was always tight in their household. Emma had learned early not to ask for things they couldn't afford. New clothes, school trips, even simple treats from the corner shop were luxuries they rarely enjoyed. Emma wore the same 3 sweaters to school, mended carefully by her mother's patient hands. Her shoes had holes that she covered with tape, hoping no one would notice. But late at night, when her mother was at her cleaning job at the hospital, Emma found peace in cooking. The apartment would be quiet except for the soft sounds of her movements in the kitchen. She would pull out her most precious possession, her grandmother's old recipe notebook. The pages were yellow with age, some torn at the edges, and the cover was held together with brown tape. Emma's grandmother, Rose, had been a baker in their small English town before she passed away 3 years ago. Rose had owned a tiny shop called Rose's Kitchen, where she made fresh bread every morning and meat pies that people traveled from neighboring towns to taste. The recipes in the notebook were written in Rose's careful handwriting, with fountain pen ink that had faded to a soft blue dot between the ingredient lists and cooking instructions. Rose had written little notes that made Emma smile. At Love with the Flour, one recipe said, "Cook with patience, not speed." Said another, "Feed the heart, not just the stomach." Was written in the margin of her famous apple tart recipe. These handwritten words were like having conversations with her grandmother. Even though Rose was gone, the recipes were Emma's greatest treasure. She had memorized most of them, but she still liked to read Rose's notes while she cooked. It made her feel connected to something larger than her quiet, lonely life. One cold evening in November, Emma found a crumpled flyer on the kitchen table when she came home from school. Her mother must have picked it up somewhere during her day. Emma smoothed out the wrinkles and read the bold letters at the top. Young Chef Britain, National Cooking Competition. The flyer explained that young people between 14 and 18 could enter a cooking contest. They would compete in different rounds, showing their skills and creativity. The winner would receive £50,000 to attend the best cooking school in the country. Emma's heart began to race as she imagined what that money could mean. No more worrying about rent. No more watching her mother come home exhausted every night. Maybe even her own restaurant someday. But then Emma read the details more carefully, and her excitement turned to fear. The competition wasn't just about cooking in private. Contestants had to appear on television, cooking live in front of cameras and judges. They had to explain their dishes, talk about their techniques, and answer questions from famous chefs. The final round would be broadcast to millions of people across the country. Emma's hands began to shake because she held the flyer. Speaking to one person was difficult enough for her. At school, she could barely whisper answers when teachers called on her. The idea of speaking on television with bright lights and cameras pointing at her, felt completely impossible. Her throat felt tight just thinking about it. She folded the flyer carefully and tucked it inside her grandmother's cookbook, between the pages of the chicken pie recipe. Maybe, if she hid it away, she could forget about the competition and the dream that felt too big for someone like her. That night, Emma made her grandmother's chicken and vegetable pie. She diced onions until her eyes watered, browned chunks of chicken until they were golden, and added carrots and peas that filled the kitchen with color. As she rolled out the pastry with her grandmother's old wooden rolling pin, she let her mind wander. She imagined having her own restaurant someday, with white tablecloths and customers who smiled when they tasted her food. She pictured herself wearing a chef's coat with her name embroidered on it, teaching young cooks the way her grandmother had taught her. But the dream felt as far away as the moon. Beautiful to look at but impossible to reach, the pie filled their small apartment with the most wonderful smell, and Emma allowed herself to hope, just for a moment, that dreams sometimes do come true. 4 weeks after finding the flyer, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the cooking competition every night after finishing her homework. She would pull the crumpled paper from her grandmother's cookbook and read it over and over. The words seemed to glow on the page. £50,000, cooking school, national television. The deadline was only 2 months away, and each passing day made the opportunity feel more urgent. Emma began practicing harder than ever before. After her mother, Kate, left for her evening job at the hospital, Emma would transform their tiny kitchen into her own personal cooking school. She would spread her grandmother's recipes across the small counter and challenge herself to create elaborate meals using only the few ingredients they could afford. Their refrigerator was usually nearly empty, containing only the basics: milk that was close to expiring, a few eggs, some wilted vegetables, and whatever meat had been marked down at the grocery store. But Emma learned to make magic with these simple things. She discovered that 3 potatoes could become crispy golden cakes when mixed with a beaten egg and fried carefully in their one good pan. Carrots that were starting to go soft became sweet and tender when roasted with a sprinkle of salt. And the smallest drop of honey. When her mother brought home beef that was tough and cheap, Emma would cook it slowly for hours until it fell apart with tenderness. She learned that time and patience could transform the most humble ingredients into something special. Every evening became an experiment, and every meal became a small victory. The kitchen filled with wonderful smells night after night. Emma didn't realize that these aromas were drifting through the thin walls of their old building, reaching the apartment next door where an elderly woman lived alone. Mrs. Harris had been their neighbor for as long as Emma could remember, but they had never really spoken beyond polite nods in the hallway. Emma knew that Mrs. Harris was a widow who lived by herself, and sometimes Emma could hear her moving round her apartment, the soft sounds of footsteps and the occasional clink of dishes. One Thursday evening, while Emma was making a pot of her grandmother's vegetable soup, she heard something she had never heard before: a gentle knock at their door. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door carefully, expecting to see her mother returning early from work. Instead, Mrs. Harris stood in the hallway. She was a small woman with silver hair neatly pulled back and kind blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a soft cardigan and house slippers, and her face wore an expression of gentle curiosity. "I am so sorry to bother you, dear," Mrs. Harris said in a voice that was warm like tea, "but something smells absolutely wonderful coming from your apartment. I was wondering if you might like some company for dinner. I haven't had a proper conversation in days, and I thought perhaps we could share a meal together." Emma felt her usual nervousness rise in her chest. But something about Mrs. Harris's gentle manner made her feel safe. She nodded, too nervous to speak, and stepped aside to let her neighbor into their small apartment. Mrs. Harris looked round the tiny kitchen with appreciation, taking in the neat arrangement of cooking utensils and the pot of soup simmering on the stove. Emma served her a bowl of the vegetable soup in one of their few good bowls, her hands shaking slightly as she ladled the steaming liquid. Mrs. Harris took one careful spoonful, and her eyes widened with surprise and delight. She took another spoonful, then another, savoring each taste. Finally, she looked up at Emma with genuine amazement. "This is absolutely extraordinary," Mrs. Harris said. "I haven't tasted soup this good since I was a young woman. The flavors are perfect, and there's something special about it that I can't quite identify. Who taught you to cook like this?" Emma felt her cheeks grow warm with the compliment. She whispered so softly that Mrs. Harris had to lean forward to hear her. "My grandmother." "She taught you very well indeed," Mrs. Harris said with a smile. "You have a real gift. Dear, cooking like this is an art, and you're clearly an artist." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Harris began visiting Emma regularly. She would arrive just as Emma was starting to prepare dinner, and Emma found herself looking forward to these visits. Mrs. Harris would sit at their small kitchen table, sipping tea and sharing stories about her past while Emma cooked. Emma learned that Mrs. Harris had once owned a small restaurant with her husband in the town center. They had run it together for 30 years before he passed away 5 years ago. Mrs. Harris had sold the restaurant because she couldn't bear to run it without him, but she still remembered every recipe and every regular customer. As the days passed, something wonderful began to happen. Emma found herself talking more in Mrs. Harris's presence. At first, she just answered questions with single words or nods, but gradually, she began to share her own thoughts and feelings. Mrs. Harris listened to everything with patience and interest, never making Emma feel rushed or judged. Finally, Emma found the courage to tell Mrs. Harris about her dreams of cooking school and her discovery of the competition. She even showed her the crumpled flyer, explaining how much the opportunity meant to her, but how terrified she was of the public speaking required. Mrs. Harris read the flyer carefully, then looked at Emma with determination. "You should enter this competition," she said firmly. Emma immediately shook her head. "I can't speak in front of people. I can barely talk to you, and you're so kind." "How could I ever speak on television?" Mrs. Harris reached across the small table and patted Emma's hand gently. "Cooking is speaking. Dear, you just use different words when you cook. You tell stories about love, about tradition, about care for others. That's the most important kind of speaking there is." Mrs. Harris had a plan to help Emma build her confidence, and it started with something simple but powerful: sharing food with others. She convinced Emma that the best way to practice speaking through cooking was to let her food do the talking. "First, we'll start small," Mrs. Harris explained one evening as they sat in Emma's kitchen. "There are people in this building who are lonely, just like I was before I met you. Some are elderly, some are struggling, and some have simply forgotten what it feels like to have someone care about them. Your cooking could brighten their days." Emma felt nervous about the idea, but Mrs. Harris made it feel safe. They would work together. Emma would prepare the food, putting all her care and skill into each dish. Mrs. Harris would deliver the meals with small handwritten notes that simply said, "From a friend who cares, this way." Emma could share her gift without having to face the scary part of talking to strangers. Their first delivery was to Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment directly above them. Emma had often heard her moving round late at night, and Mrs. Harris explained that Mrs. Thompson had trouble sleeping since her husband died the year before. Emma prepared a hearty beef stew with fresh bread, the kind of meal that could warm someone from the inside out. The next morning, Emma found a small card slipped under her door. In shaky handwriting, Mrs. Thompson had written, "Thank you, dear friend. That was the most delicious meal I've had in months. It reminded me of the stews my mother used to make. You have a gift." Emma felt a warm glow in her chest as she read the card. Her food had brought comfort to someone who needed it, and that felt more meaningful than any compliment she had ever received. Words seemed to travel quietly through their building. Mrs. Harris helped Emma identify other neighbors who might benefit from a surprise meal. There was Mr. James, who lived in the apartment below them and worked long hours as a security guard. He often looked tired and ate nothing but sandwiches and instant noodles. Emma prepared a shepherd's pie for him, carefully layering seasoned meat and vegetables under a blanket of creamy mashed potatoes. There was also young Sophie, a single mother with twin babies who lived at the end of the hall. Emma could sometimes hear the babies crying through the thin walls, and she imagined how exhausted Sophie must be. Emma made a large pot of chicken soup with soft vegetables that would be easy for Sophie to eat. Quickly, between caring for her children as weeks passed, something magical began to happen in their building. People who had lived side by side for years without speaking began to smile at Emma in the hallways. Mrs. Thompson would pat Emma's shoulder gently when they met at the mailboxes. Mr. James began offering to carry Emma's groceries when he saw her struggling with heavy bags from the store. Sophie stopped Emma one day to whisper a heartfelt thank you. Tears in her eyes, Emma realized that her food was creating connections she had never been able to make with words. Each meal she cooked carried her feelings and intentions. When she made soup for someone who was sad, she stirred in comfort and warmth. When she baked bread for someone who was lonely, she needed in companionship and care. When she prepared a special dinner for someone celebrating a small victory, she seasoned it with joy and encouragement. The cooking gave Emma a way to express herself that felt natural and true. She was still the same quiet girl who struggled to speak in crowds, but through her food, she was having conversations with people all around her building. She was saying, "I care about you and you're not alone and you deserve something beautiful," without ever having to find the words. With only 1 week left before the competition deadline, Mrs. Harris made a suggestion that both excited and terrified Emma. "I think it's time to make a practice video," she said gently. "You've been speaking through your cooking for weeks now. Let's see what happens when you add your actual voice to the mix." Emma's mother, Kate, had finally learned about the competition when she found Emma and Mrs. Harris discussing it in the kitchen one evening. At first, Kate was worried about her shy daughter appearing on television, but when she saw how much cooking meant to Emma and how much she had grown in confidence, Kate gave her full support. They set up Kate's old mobile phone on a stack of cookbooks to create a makeshift camera in their small kitchen. Emma arranged her ingredients carefully on the counter: ground lamb, fresh vegetables, potatoes, and the collection of herbs and spices that would make her grandmother's special shepherd's pie. Emma's hands shook as she began to cook, aware of the camera recording her every movement. But as she started working with the familiar ingredients, muscle memory took over. Her movements became smooth and confident as she browned the meat and chopped the vegetables, to her own surprise. Emma began to speak softly to the camera. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady and clear. She talked about her grandmother Rose, describing how Rose had taught her that cooking was an act of love. She explained the secret blend of herbs that Rose had never written down, only whispered to Emma during their last cooking session together before Rose became too sick to stand in the kitchen. Emma spoke about dreams that seemed too big for someone like her, about wanting to honor her grandmother's memory, and about the way food could bring people together even when words failed. As she layered the mashed potatoes over the meat and vegetable mixture, she talked about how cooking had given her a voice when her own voice seemed lost. When she finished cooking and turned off the camera, Emma felt drained, but also strangely proud. They watched the video together on Kate's phone screen. Emma was amazed to see that when she talked about cooking and her grandmother, she looked confident and happy. Her quiet voice carried strength and passion. Mrs. Harris squeezed Emma's hand tightly. "Send it," she whispered with tears in her eyes. With trembling fingers, Emma uploaded the video and submitted her application to the Young Chef Britain competition. The moment she pressed the submit button, she felt a mixture of terror and relief. She had done something that seemed impossible just months before. 2 weeks later, an official letter arrived with the competition's logo on the envelope. Emma's hands shook as she opened it, reading the words that would change her life. She had been chosen as one of only 5 finalists from across the entire country. She would compete live on television in London. Emma sat on her small bed, holding the letter, and cried. The tears came partly from fear of what lay ahead, but mostly from hope for the future she had never dared to imagine. The television studio in London was bigger and brighter than anything Emma had ever seen in her life. Enormous lights hung from the ceiling like mechanical suns, casting everything in a harsh white glow that made her eyes water. Camera crews moved around the space like busy ants, pushing equipment on wheels and adjusting angles with practiced efficiency. Producers walked quickly between the cooking stations, speaking rapidly into their headsets and checking clipboards with intense concentration. Emma stood near the entrance, feeling impossibly small in the vast space. Her simple dress, the nicest one she owned, felt shabby compared to the sleek uniforms worn by the crew members. She clutched her grandmother's old recipe card in her pocket, the paper soft and warm from years of handling. The other 4 contestants seemed to belong in this world in ways that Emma did not. They chatted easily with the reporters who interviewed them, laughing and making jokes like they appeared on television every day. One boy, who looked about 17, was demonstrating knife techniques for a camera crew. A girl with perfectly styled hair was explaining her culinary training to a journalist, using words like molecular gastronomy and flavor profiles that Emma had never heard before. Emma tried to make herself even smaller, hoping no one would notice her standing alone by the wall. She watched the other contestants with a mixture of admiration and terror. They seemed so confident, so ready for this moment. Emma wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by entering the competition. Her mother, Kate, and Mrs. Harris sat in the small audience area that had been set up for family members. Emma could see them through the bright lights, and they waved at her with encouraging smiles. Kate looked nervous but proud, wearing her best blouse and the pearl earrings that had belonged to Emma's grandmother. Mrs. Harris gave Emma a small thumbs up, mouthing the words, "You can do this." But Emma felt like running away. Her legs felt weak, and her hands were shaking so badly that she had to clasp them together to keep them still. The noise of the studio seemed to press against her from all sides, making it hard to think clearly. "Contestants, please take your positions at your cooking stations," called Lucy, the show's host. She was a cheerful woman with bright red hair and an enormous smile that never seemed to fade. She wore a crisp white dress and moved through the studio with the kind of confidence that Emma envied. Emma walked to her assigned cooking station on legs that felt unsteady and unreliable. Each step seemed to take forever, and she was certain that everyone in the studio was watching her awkward progress. The cooking station was beautiful and intimidating, with professional equipment that gleamed under the studio lights. Everything was perfectly organized and spotlessly clean. The ingredients she had requested were laid out before her like an artist's palette. Fresh vegetables sat in small bowls, their colors bright and appealing. Tender beef waited on a cutting board, dark red and marbled with fat. Herbs and spices were ranged in tiny glass containers. each one labeled with neat handwriting. Everything she needed to make her grandmother's shepherd's pie was there, but seeing the ingredients laid out so formally made the familiar recipe seem strange and foreign. The cameras began moving into position round the cooking stations, their red recording, lights blinking on like electronic eyes. Emma's vision blurred slightly as panic began to creep up her throat, making it hard to swallow. She felt dizzy and wondered if she might faint in front of all these people and cameras. The studio audience, which included families and friends of the contestants, grew quiet as the filming began. Emma could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, and she knew that soon millions more would be watching from their homes across the country. "Welcome to Young Chef Britain," Lucy announced to the cameras, her voice ringing through the studio. "Today, 5 of the most talented young cooks in the country will compete for a £50,000 scholarship to culinary school. They have 90 minutes to prepare their signature dish, the recipe that represents their culinary journey and their dreams for the future." Emma closed her eyes and tried to take a deep breath, but her chest felt tight. She thought of her grandmother's hands, strong and gentle, teaching her to knead bread dough on Sunday mornings. She remembered the way Rose would hum while she cooked, filling their small kitchen with music and warmth. She recalled Mrs. Harris saying that cooking was another way of speaking, that Emma's hands could say things her voice never could. "Your time starts now," Lucy called out, and immediately the studio exploded with activity. Emma opened her eyes and looked down at her ingredients. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. Then, as if by magic, her hands began to move without conscious thought. She reached for an onion and began to dice it with quick, precise cuts that her grandmother had taught her years ago. The familiar rhythm of the knife against the cutting board calmed her racing heart like a lullaby. Round her, the other contestants moved with frantic energy, talking to themselves and calling out to the cameras, but Emma worked with quiet focus, letting muscle memory guide her movements. She had made this recipe hundreds of times in her tiny kitchen at home, and her hands knew exactly what to do. She heated oil in the pan and added the diced onions, listening for the gentle sizzle that told her the temperature was perfect. The sweet smell of cooking onions began to fill her small corner of the studio, reminding her of home and safety. Next, she browned the beef until it was perfectly caramelized, each piece developing a rich, dark crust that would add depth to the final dish. She added the vegetables one at a time, watching as they softened and released their flavors. Finally, she sprinkled in her grandmother's secret blend of herbs, thyme for earthiness, rosemary for warmth, and just a tiny touch of cinnamon that Rose had sworn made all the difference. As the meat and vegetables simmered together, filling the air with rich, comforting aromas, Emma began to prepare her pastry. She rolled it out with gentle, even strokes, the way Rose had taught her, applying just enough pressure to create a smooth, uniform thickness. The studio noise seemed to fade away until there was nothing but Emma, her ingredients, and her grandmother's love flowing through her hands. "Time," Lucy called out, and Emma looked down at her plate in surprise. Before her sat a perfect shepherd's pie, its golden pastry top gleaming under the studio lights. The rich, fragrant filling peeked out round the edges, and the whole dish looked exactly as it should. Emma realized that despite her fear and nervousness, her hands had created something beautiful. "Now," Lucy announced with her bright television smile, "each contestant will present their dish to our panel of judges. This is your chance to tell the story behind your creation and share what makes your dish special." Emma watched from her cooking station as the other contestants took their turns. The first was James, the confident boy who had been demonstrating knife skills earlier. He carried his elaborate pasta dish to the judges' table with sure steps, speaking smoothly about his use of truffle oil and handmade noodles. His voice carried clearly through the studio as he explained complex cooking techniques with ease. Next came Sarah, the girl with the perfectly styled hair. She presented a dessert that looked like a work of art, with delicate sugar decorations and colorful sauces ranged in precise patterns. She used words Emma had never heard before, talking about texture contrasts and flavor balance with the confidence of someone much older. The third contestant was Michael, who had created a fish dish with what he called modern presentation techniques. He spoke about his culinary school training and his plans to open his own restaurant someday. The judges nodded and asked thoughtful questions, clearly impressed by his knowledge and ambition. Emma felt her heart sink with each presentation. These contestants belonged in this world of professional cooking and television cameras. They knew the right words to say and the right way to say them. They looked comfortable under the bright lights, as if they had been born for this moment. Then Lucy turned to Emma with her encouraging smile. "Emma, you're next. Please bring your dish to the judges." Emma's legs felt like they were made of water as she picked up her plate. The shepherd's pie looked simple compared to the elaborate creations the other contestants had made. There were no fancy decorations or complex sauces. Just golden pastry covering a humble filling of meat and vegetables. Emma worried that it looked too ordinary, too much like something anyone could make at home. She walked to the judges' table on shaking legs, each step feeling like it took forever. The three judges sat behind the wide table, looking professional and intimidating in their chef's coats. David, the head judge, was a famous chef Emma had seen on cooking shows. Sarah was a pastry expert who had written several cookbooks. The judge, Marcus, owned restaurants in 3 different cities. Behind the judges, cameras captured every moment from multiple angles. Emma could see the red recording lights blinking at her like electronic eyes. The studio audience was completely silent, waiting to hear what she would say. "Tell us about your dish, Emma," David said in a kind voice that reminded Emma of her grandfather. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her throat felt completely closed, as if someone had tied a knot in it. The silence stretched on and on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. She could feel sweat forming on her forehead under the hot studio lights. She looked out at the audience and saw her mother, Kate, sitting in the front row. Kate had tears in her eyes, but she was still smiling and nodding encouragingly. Next to her sat Mrs. Harris, who gave Emma a small wave and mouthed the words, "You can do this." Emma looked down at her plate and felt something shift inside her chest. This was not just food on a plate. This was her grandmother's love, passed down through 3 generations. This was the recipe that had fed her family through hard times and celebrations. This was the dish that had taught her that cooking was another way of loving people. "This is my grandmother's shepherd's pie," Emma said softly, but her voice carried clearly through the quiet studio. She called it her love pie because she said every ingredient was chosen with love. As she spoke, Emma felt her voice growing stronger. The familiar words about her grandmother and her cooking seemed to unlock something inside her that had been waiting to be heard. "I know I'm not the loudest person here," Emma continued, looking directly at the judges. "I've always been quiet, but my grandmother taught me that there are many ways to speak to people. Food is one of them. When you cook for someone, you're telling them that they matter, that they deserve something good." Emma lifted the serving spoon with steady hands and carefully placed a portion of the shepherd's pie in each judge's plate. The golden pastry broke apart to reveal the rich, aromatic filling underneath. Steam rose from the warm food, carrying a sense of herbs and slowly cooked vegetables. "This recipe has been in my family for 3 generations," Emma explained, as she served. "It's made with simple ingredients that most people have in their kitchen, But the secret isn't in expensive or exotic things. The secret is patience and care. Just like the best things in life, the judges began to taste the dish. In thoughtful silence, Emma watched their faces carefully, trying to read their expressions. David closed his eyes as he chewed, as if he was concentrating on every flavor. Sarah nodded slightly after her first bite, and Marcus took a second spoonful immediately. "The flavors are absolutely incredible," Sarah said, looking up at Emma with genuine surprise and pleasure. "This is comfort food at its finest. But tell us more about yourself, Emma. What does winning this competition mean to you?" Emma thought of all the nights she had lain awake dreaming of cooking school, imagining herself learning from professional chefs and eventually opening her own small restaurant where she could feed Peo. "Pull and make them happy. I want to honor my grandmother's memory," Emma said, her voice steady and clear. She believed that food brings people together, that it can comfort the sad and celebrate with the happy. "She taught me that feeding someone is one of the most loving things you can do. I want to learn everything I can about cooking so I can carry on that tradition and maybe teach it to others someday." She paused, looking at each judge in turn. "I may be quiet, but I have so much I want to say through my food. Every dish tells a story, and I have many stories I want to share." The judges deliberated for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Emma stood with the other contestants, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, the judges returned to their table, and David stood up with an envelope in his hands. "The winner of this year's Young Chef Britain Scholarship," David announced, his voice carrying clearly through the studio, "is Emma, for her exceptional skill, her heartfelt presentation, and a dish that truly speaks from the heart." Emma couldn't believe what she was hearing. The words seemed to float in the air around her, too wonderful to be real. Through her tears of joy and disbelief, she saw her mother and Mrs. Harris jumping up from their seats and cheering loudly. Lucy appeared beside her with a giant check for £50,000 and an official letter of acceptance to the country's most prestigious cooking school. That evening, back in their small apartment above the bakery, Emma cooked dinner for her mother and Mrs. Harris. It was simple food, just pasta with fresh vegetables and herbs, but it tasted like celebration and new beginnings. The tiny kitchen that had once felt cramped now felt warm and full of possibility. "I'm so proud of you," Kate said, hugging her daughter tight. "You did something I never could have imagined possible." Mrs. Harris smiled with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud too, dear. You found your voice today, and what a beautiful voice it is." Emma looked round their tiny kitchen, the same place where she had felt so alone and invisible just months ago. Now it felt full of love and infinite possibility. She had learned that being quiet didn't mean she had nothing important to say. Sometimes the most powerful messages are shared not with words, but with kindness, care, and the simple act of feeding others with love. The scholarship would certainly change her life, opening doors she had never dreamed possible. But the real victory was discovering that she had never been truly alone. Her voice had been there all along, waiting patiently for the right moment to be heard. The end.